We have the topic, which is global trade and financial governance for inclusive development. We have heard the minister covering the entire gamut of issues which would normally be covered in this subject. I have a very distinguished panel with me, and I have Mr. Manuel Montes, who will be co-chairing. So it is my privilege to partner with him in this process. What I propose to do is just make a few introductory observations and then start in the order in which it's been given in the program brochure. And then what I would do is about 5 minutes to each panelist to make his observations so that we have good enough time, though I can see that we are moving fast towards the 1 o'clock deadline. But a 5-minute observation from each of the panelists, and then we will have questions and comments. So that's the way we propose to move. Now, as far as the context of this session is concerned, I have already indicated that the minister has, in a sense, brought out the fact of urgency and the fact of the manner in which global developments are happening. But let me just try and compartmentalize the kind of challenges that we have for our trade and financial governance, and then try and see how the panelists would respond to a variety of questions which would arise out of that. Now, first of all, let us look at the macro structure, macro issues. We are very aware the manner in which the global economy seems to be slowing down, has significantly slowed down. Now, whether this slowing down is a cyclical phenomena or whether it's a structural phenomena, there is a debate going on. The jury is out. Irrespective of that, whatever it is, the fact that the global demand is getting affected. So that was the first point. Now, while this is happening, there is this huge dimension of trade being weaponized as an instrument for settling a larger power game is something which is relatively new to this discourse. And this is where I think a big challenge comes, because it is not just the fact of the Chinese economy in the normal course slowing down, but it is also now this aggravation brought in by the trade conflict between the US and China, that the whole matter has acquired a sort of a sinister, a sort of a monstrous proportion, and we have started seeing the manner in which the rest of the global economy is taking these developments. Every day you have one or the other indication coming out in the form of an index, in form of national economies slowing down, sectoral economies coming down. India itself is witnessing a large churn in many sectors. So that was the second point. The third point, which is more or less related, is this huge protectionism which is come on as a hydra-headed challenge. Of course, they are all interrelated, and I don't want to get into the history of how it all started, and we are all aware of that. But the important point is that protectionism clearly closes markets or opens markets with the kind of closures that the minister was mentioning. And therefore, it throws a huge challenge, particularly to the developing world, because the developing world is not prepared for dealing with those challenges, particularly the challenges of the non-tariff kind, which they face. So that is one set of, and this all is housed in one of the consequences, one of the major consequences, that is sort of a derailment of multilateralism. Now, the derailment of multilateralism is witnessed more significantly in the manner in which WTO is moving or not moving, but it has been seen in the past also in the manner in which Paris Agreement concluded, the manner in which some parties reneged, and so on and so forth. WTO is going through a tremendous churn, and particularly the point which I mentioned earlier, the special and differential treatment, which was some sort of a bedrock of the relationship between the developed and the developing world in the WTO, has come into huge challenge, and the cracks are visible. In such situation, the irony is that very often, because of very short-term or very sometimes inadequacies of understanding, it is very difficult to hold the developing world together, hold the South together. It is more so pronounced because there are huge diversities. And what could be convenient or what could be suitable in the long-term interest of A country may not be convenient for the B country. So therefore, it is very difficult to find a common position within the developing world on a variety of issues which we have seen, and I'll mention a short while later. The second development, so this is broadly the politico-economic firmament which is emerging. The second big issue here is the manner in which technology is challenging all of us. The pace at which technology is throwing up newer and newer challenges by the day. And the fact that much of the developing world is either not prepared in terms of inadequacies of human resource capacities, financial inadequacies, technical capacities to absorb these developments or even to understand these developments, and the consequential legal and institutional changes that are required to deal with these developments. So there is this huge black box where we have been observing for several years now that challenges come. We find developing countries agree to propositions which are not conducive to their interest. We saw that happening in Bali in the ministerial meeting of WTO. We are again seeing that happening in the WTO in the context of some plurilateral agreements and so on and so forth. But the point is, the single point which really binds us all together is this need for sharing information, knowledge, etc., to bridge these inadequacies. The third point, which is more within the national boundaries, is how does the gains of this growth or this development percolate down? Has globalization helped us bring up equality, bring up, or has it further diminished this whole dimension of equality? There are examples, I mean, it's not difficult to find, whether it's between nations or within nations. We have seen inequality rise. We have seen the gap between the richest and the poorest has widened. And all of this throws a big challenge of distribution, throws a big challenge of a variety of other issues, but in a more tangible context, it's the challenge of distribution, inclusion. How do we involve people in the manner in which these processes, these growth parameters are achieved? And that is where the role of technology comes in very handy. It is a big challenge for the developing world because we know technology throws a large challenge to manufacturing in terms of its employment intensities decline. We also know that technology throws a large challenge to services because when it throws a challenge in terms of skill inadequacies, skill deficiencies, it throws in terms of the preparedness of a country to absorb a technology. And therefore, you have large challenges, which it's very difficult to see whether they really help you or don't help you, or there are segments which help you and segments which don't help you, and how to discern them. And one illustration which I can very well give is this whole dimension of digital economy, the e-commerce, and so on and so forth. There are elements which are of great interest, which are of great relevance and benefit to the developing world, and there are elements where we have to be very cautious. Now, this is all which throws up challenges and questions. The organizers have already drafted 3 questions, and they've been shared with the panelists. I just want to nuance some of those questions, and maybe the panelists would like to also address some of these concerns, though some of them are contained in those 3 questions. The first is how to protect institutions which have helped or have the potential to help them deal with their very basic challenges of poverty and terms of trade from becoming dysfunctional and irrelevant. And we have the case of WTO in our mind. Secondly, how to deal with the challenges of inadequacies of capacities, both in human and technical resources, I have already mentioned. Thirdly, what kind of regional and sectoral formulations do we need to help their people and economic operators to help each other and learn from each other? The very bedrock of partnership that we are talking of. Fourthly, how should they strengthen the new institutions of the South in being more competent and capable in serving their mandate of delivery of services to a wider set of developing members and their people? And I have examples of the new bank, new development bank, examples of the infrastructure development bank, and a variety of other institutions in the third world. Fifthly, in view of the multilateralism in trade failing the test of taking on the political challenges as they emerge, how do they organize themselves to restore the centrality of multilateralism in trade? I don't think it requires a debate. Multilateralism has helped all of us. How so reluctant we might have been at the time of entering the WTO, but in the long run, it has helped most of us. And I think, therefore, retaining that multilateral system, albeit with reforms which are necessary, which also the minister alluded to, are important. Sixthly, how can the developing world participate in harnessing the new technology for the benefit of improving their economic conditions, competitiveness, and make their financial governance more inclusive? And this is where a huge program segment in terms of the startup has evolved, not just in India, but in most other countries. How to use financial software technology in order to make financial governance more inclusive. I think this is something which all countries are trying, and many of them are succeeding. And seventhly, and the last, how can South-South cooperation help in reducing transactional costs in trade and finance in order to enlarge the size of the global pie for them? So these are some of the thoughts that I am raising. I would urge my panelists to keep them in mind while making their interventions or respond to them at a later stage in response to the questions. May I now start with, as I said, I would go by the brochure, and therefore I would request Dr. Neil Shetri, who is a professor at University of North Carolina, and Dr. Shetri is professor at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. He holds a PhD in business administration from University of Rhode Island. He worked as a consultant for the Asian Development Bank. He also participated as lead discussant at the peer review meeting of the UN's Information Economy Report 2013 and 2015. He is a two-time winner of Pacific Telecommunication Council's Mehru Jasawala Research Paper Prize. So it's over to you, Dr. Shetri. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the RIS and Professor Sachin Chaturvedi for inviting me here for this opportunity. And I'll mainly focus on the technology part. Right now, according to the World Bank's Findex, there are about 1.7 billion people in the world who do not have any account with the financial institutions or even with the mobile money providers. And if you look at the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, there are about 445 million of them in the developing world, and they are playing a very important role in the economy. They account for 33% of the GDP only in the formal sector and 45% of job creation, but they are not very good in utilizing these modern technology like the big data, artificial intelligence, blockchain, and all those things. So those things, utilizing those technologies properly might solve many of the problems that we are having today. First thing is that there is, in the developing countries or the global south, about $380 billion with B dollar unmet need of loans that people want and the small and medium-sized companies want, and which is only in the Asian economies, developing Asian economies, about $200 billion. The main reason why poor people or small and medium-sized enterprises do not get loan is not because they lack creditworthiness, but the banks or financial institutions right now, they lack data, they lack information, and they lack capability to assess poor people's or small and medium-sized enterprises' creditworthiness. That is the number one reason. But data, the availability of data is changing that. Right now, according to the International Telecommunications Union, the developing countries have a cell phone penetration of close to 103%. Every 100 people, there are 103 cell phones. Even in the least developed countries, the penetration is about 73%. That means there is a lot of data. So all these new fintech companies are coming up with solutions, and they are even better than the traditional those companies that use kind of different models to assess creditworthiness. One example is there is this First Access, which is a financial technology fintech company based in the US, and that works in many developing countries, including Tanzania. In Tanzania, actually, if you go to apply for a loan in a bank, and the bank people have to go to visit the home and business and do all the documents check, and it costs about $20. But another alternative, the first bank, just if the company, first access company looks at anyone's mobile phone, how people are using the mobile phone. Just looking at the mobile phone, it can assess people's creditworthiness, and that gives data for $1.25. Instead of $20, spending $20 average visiting people's home, they can just get data for $1.25 and make decision about kind of making loan to people. And this is important because according to the Village Savings and Loans Association, in Tanzania, the average loan people take is only $61. Actually, in Uganda, it is $37. $61, $37 is what people take average loan, and $20 it costs for the bank to go to visit people's home. And that problem can be solved with this big data. And that is the first access is a US company, and there is even more efficient, like the Chinese company Alibaba, which processes, if anyone applies for a loan, the company processes the loan document. The entire process takes 3 minutes and costs only 0.3 yuan, which is, if we convert to US dollar, it becomes about less than 5 cents of US dollar. Actually, this is 1/25th of how much the first access is charging. So this is a solution that emerged from the global south countries. So these problems are these are solving those problems, and they use a lot of different data, like the data from the government agency, biometric data, and data from satellite, and roof image, and the land plot, and a lot of things like the hobbies that people have. If people are spending a lot of time in gambling, they may not have good creditworthiness. Or if they have friends, for example, I have a friend who is very nice, who is a very honest person, but the only problem is that he doesn't pay his loan in time. And actually, if I am friend with him, my creditworthiness actually hurts, according to this kind of big data company. And so they use a lot of these, what time of the day they do online shopping. If someone is doing at 2 p.m., that indicates that that person may not have a job. And so creditworthiness is low. They are using all this information, and so to make loans accessible. And so I don't have a lot of time. So what I can do is, big data is one solution, but it has mainly 3 problems. One is, many people do not use any data, social media, they don't have phone. Actually, if you go to these least developed countries, only 72.4% people have any type of phone. Non-users automatically are excluded because they do not have any data to create, assess creditworthiness. Second problem is, there is a lot of complaints that these companies misuse, big data companies misuse and abuse people's data. Actually, they did a survey in China, the China Youth Daily, and 76% of people in China think that these companies like Alibaba and all those companies are misusing people's data. And they use the big data companies are using some type of a correlation. That means if I have a friend who doesn't have a good creditworthiness, they rate my creditworthiness also lower. And correlation actually doesn't really reflect the cause-effect type of relationship. So those are some of the problems. So I think there are a lot of these blockchain-based solutions that are launching, and my favorite are, there are 4 companies that I talk about that basically trying to solve these poor people's problem using the most latest technology, blockchain. There is one company in Brazil, Moeda means in Portuguese money, and it is using blockchain to make loans available to poor people. And there is this British company, Humanic, that uses biometric ID, and because 1 billion people in the world do not have any ID, and so it has its own cryptocurrency, Humanic token, and trying to help people. And there is the Kiva, which is a micro-lending company, and which is trying to use blockchain, cryptocurrency, and trying to create some type of ID. And there is this US company, BanQ, and which already created economic history of more than 28,000 people. So those solutions actually try to overcome some of the challenges that the big data solution have. And I think I'll come back to this thing later, probably. I'll give time to my other panelists to talk about the things, and thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Dr. Shetri. Let me also tell you that I have my co-chair who would be at the end of the four panelists. I would request him to make his observations, and he would also tend to summarize the view from the dais, and then we will open it to the questions. Yeah, may I now request Mr. Mario Pezzini, who is the director of OECD Development Center, and before joining the Development Center in 2010, Mr. Pezzini held several senior management positions in the OECD, where he has been working since 1995. Prior to joining the OECD, Mr. Pezzini was professor in industrial economics at École Nationale Supérieure de Mines Paris, don't mind my pronunciation, please, as well as in the US and Italian universities. Thank you, Mr. Pezzini.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to engage in the discussion that was introduced also this morning, and in particular, Li Xiaoyun and this sense of urgency that appear, under my point of view, not only in the word of the minister, but also in the other presentation this morning. And to do that, I would like to address three issues. The first is, sorry for being provocative, but the time at hand is limited. So, is trade and financial flows a sufficient condition to ensure further development? Second, are we facing a new contest? And third, what should be a new cooperation system looks like? Before starting, I ask just 30-second additional time just to introduce my organization, because it's the first time that we are invited in this event, and we hope to come also the next time from now on, and therefore just give me a second. And the second is about the fact that in my organization, the Development Center, we have 57 members that pay the budget of the organization. And out of these 57, only 23 are OECD countries. So you make a quick calculation. If you identify OECD, and sometimes saying OECD, you think to the DAC, the Development Center is another animal. Up to you to decide if we are south, if we are north, if we are in between, if we are triangular, but the data is particularly evident. Let me say also that out of these flags that I have behind me, 16 countries are members of the Development Center. Therefore, with this introduction, let me make my comments on the topic. And the first, as I said, is trade and financial flows a sufficient condition for further development? This has been a belief, almost religious, in the last 40 years. And obviously, we may quote many data that would appear as evidences to support this idea. In 2009, the GDP in PPP of non-OECD countries became more important, and from then on remain more important than the one of the OECD country. The BRICS cover now, or better in 2018, 35% of the global GDP. I say BRICS because I add Indonesia. Since the 90s, 54 countries changed their status if measured in terms of GDP. So from low to middle, from middle to high, and so on. And the South-South trades was multiplied 18 times between 90 and 2016. All these data tend to say, yes, this was the result of trade. Are we sure? Of course, trade contributed. It was probably a necessary condition, but sufficient? And financial flows were as well a sufficient condition? I would raise quickly, to end my point, three considerations. The first is that we do not have only trade barriers as a trap or obstacles to further development. We used to refer to poverty trap, for example, and obviously is a trap. It requires specific policies, but there are many more other traps that make that even if a country may have increase in terms of GDP, so in terms of growth, development is not necessarily a partner of growth. And among these traps, I make in the discussion several examples, but you may quote the Dutch disease, and in fact, countries like Chile have increased their dependency from copper in the last 40 years, not reduced. And as Chile, many other countries are in this condition. And the functioning of the public administration is in many countries entering in a loop that does the people delegitimize the intervention of the public sector and therefore reduce the fiscal capacity of the state that will provide even less quality services. So for all these reasons, my feeling is that we have to deal with structural issues at the same time that we trade and financial flows issues. The regulation of the economic functioning is not a sufficient condition for further growth and development. If this is true, I very strongly agree with the inspiration of Dr. Sachin Development Compact idea. The idea that different parts of the policy needs to be coherent make a lot of sense. But I would add an additional dimension. It's not just a matter of trade, new technology, and so on. You know better than I do the compact. I think it's also a matter of addressing structural problems that were here and they remain here. And they have not been addressed by the automatic mechanism of the market. That's what I call, together with Myrdal, Hirschman, and many others, traps. And if you want to address a trap, you need policies. My feeling is that we have to go back and consider production transformation strategies, which is, by the way, one of the first objectives of the African Union. We need to consider social cohesion because many of the tensions in developing countries are now almost autonomous from growth, and therefore they require specific policy. This was my first point. My second point is much quicker, don't worry, and it has to do with trade wars and recession. Yes, the economy is not catching up. Is it a short or a long-term issue, the chair was asking? Sorry, but from 2008 crisis, we have been repeating every 6 months that the recovery was coming, and then we postponed the diagnostic, saying, no, was not this 6 months, it's the next. And in OECD countries, we are still in this logic. Then are you surprised that there are many tensions that are appearing? Yes, we are in a recession. Yes, there are trade wars. What will be the consequences of those? Obviously, we will all fight against these trade wars. But I think we have to start also considering the fact that there will be a reorganization of the economy, giving much more importance to regional dimension. If you look at the global value chain of Southeast Asia, for example, in 1995, you will see that the major customers were United States and Japan. If you look today, guess what? You will not find either Japan or United States. You will find other countries that are the main customers, and they are in Asia. The same is happening with Africa. Look, the great agreement that has been approved in Africa for the Africa trade. Latin America, under this point of view, is lagging behind. But there are strong processes that testify that the regional dimension as well will be crucial. And together with that, other phenomena of cooperation. The One Belt, One Road is a major program of international cooperation. We don't have to deal only with ODA. The Triangle North, if done as I hope, in Central America is another example of a major program that is not reconductible to ODA. The Sahel need at present, which is in a dramatic condition, is a major issue. Indian Ocean, we have heard this morning. And let me quote also an example of regional cooperation that is not from the South. but the EU structural funds have been a form of very strong regional cooperation that provided 4% of GDP to countries that were below the regional averages, and for many years. So what I conclude in this second point is, how do we intend not only to support South-South cooperation, but also regional institutions that are working on regional internal cooperation? My last point, and we conclude, sorry for the time, is it seems to me that we need a new cooperation system, and not just adjustment. Why? For many years, the idea of cooperation, the official cooperation of the North, was we have poor, let's calculate how much money we need to remove them from poverty, let's distribute the tickets from countries 0.7% of GDP, and then we will use them to reduce extreme poverty. In part, it did work. But the challenges that now we are facing are not only extreme poverty. At present, there are many more new actors that are crucial. The South, in cooperation, can we stay with the logic that was mainly structured by the North? And finally, in the past, the objective was extreme poverty. Now we discuss about a series of global public goods. So what do we need now if we need a new organization of the cooperation system? I think that first we need new measures. It's not GDP the good measure of the problem of development. As I said, you may have growth, but the traps remain at your door. Second, we need to support countries to define strategies because they have to address their structural problems. Third, we need a new multilateral cooperation. Can we have tables that remain shaped on inspiration of 40 years ago when, as was said by Lou this morning, colonialism was the issue to be addressed? Obviously, we need to reinvent the table. I like my center because I have some North, I have middle-income countries, and I have low-income countries. But probably many more centers are required. Table where different actors can sit. We need global networks, as Sachin is repeating to us, to address the single point of the compact. But I also think that we need impact assessment analysis. Why? Because the cooperation that has been done up to now has not been assessed. And so if we have principle and criteria, in reality, what has been done is just to measure if those principles were implemented, not if the measure had an impact. And therefore, I think we need to reopen this chapter as well. I try to be practical and to provide some suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pizzini, for a very thought-provocative and a very comprehensive observation. May I now request Mr. Henry Besada to make his comments. He is a Senior Research Program Advisor of the United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation, UNDP. He holds a PhD in Politics and International Studies from the University of Warwick. Mr. Besada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's wonderful to be here in India. This is my second time at the Delhi Forum. Thank you very much, Dr. Sachin, for the kind invitation, and it's always commendable, all the great leadership that you have exhibited in promoting South-South cooperation in international forums. In terms of looking at some of the questions that were identified, Mr. Chair, I would like to prioritize my responses, particularly in respect to the financial technology, in terms of how to create a globally inclusive financial architecture. According to PricewaterhouseCoopers, as of 2016, fintech corporations have raised $4.2 billion to make loans to unbanked and unbankable customers around the world. Fintech startup companies have been attracting global and growing amount of venture capital, also in terms of making, now exceeding $13 billion annually. Digital financial services are also making breakthroughs in southern economies. In Kenya, for example, 80% of adults use M-Pesa, a mobile phone system for transferring money that's spread across multiple countries in Africa, the Middle East, South Asia. In some countries, such as China, banks are partnering with fintech corporations to develop and offer innovative products and services to customers. The country is a leader now in terms of mobile payments, recording $12.8 trillion in mobile transactions from the period of January to October 2017. About 68% of interest in terms of accrued towards these companies have been made towards digital payments, compared to 15% elsewhere in the United States. Technological transformation of financial services presents a very significant opportunity for developing countries to improve financial inclusion and, by extension, economic development. As many as 2 billion people worldwide are unbanked. That is, they don't have an account at a financial institution or through a mobile money provider. Moreover, as many as 200 million micro, small, and medium enterprises across the developing South are either unserved or underserved financially and unable to access credit, either to grow their corporations or to tap into credit gap that we estimate to be around $2.2 trillion. While microfinance institutions have stepped in to fill into these gaps, micro enterprises for the past 4 decades have faced continuous constraints, including high transaction costs. The lack of financial inclusion hurts not only the poor, but also the middle class who do not have access to financial services. The heavy use of cash, which accounts for more than 90% of all transactions across developing economies, compared to 50% in advanced economies, also raises the costs and results in opportunity lost for providers. The lost opportunities for providers reflect the way the banks and other financial institutions in emerging economies are primarily designed to serve better off the customers, large businesses, and government agencies. Their lack of modern digitalized systems can limit the ability of these institutions to broaden the pool of customers and access creditworthiness of potential new borrowers. On the other hand, for financial service providers, the cost of offering customer digital accounts can be 80 to 90% lower than using physical branches. This makes the services more affordable, accessible for users, particularly low-income users in remote parts of the global South. Digital finance has the ability and the potential to fill the financial gap in many Southern economies. As such, it presents a global opportunity for growth and development. In Asia, fintech, person-to-person lending startups are proliferating, and many are actually operating across borders. For instance, Kuala Lumpur-based Crowdy has launched in 2013, now has more than 20,000 members with offices in Jakarta and Singapore. Funding societies have opened an office in Singapore and another location in Jakarta. South-South cooperation yields great potential in strengthening knowledge sharing, underlying digital financial infrastructure construction, and help developing countries enhance their capacity for constructing a digital infrastructure, such as clouds, networks, and terminals, with government officers responsible for planning and policy formulation. Second, digital financial institutions of the Global South are encouraged to strengthen knowledge sharing in business models for platform economy and application development. Our office, the UN Office for South-South Cooperation, is working with institutions such as the Finance Center for South-South Cooperation in Hong Kong and Fudan University 6 Industrial Research Institute to promote the transfer and diffusion of technology in developing countries and to help them learn from the digital experiences of others. The goal is to create digital economies from across the Global South by promoting the development of inclusive and building digital infrastructure, investing in human capital, and securing necessary knowledge and tools. In terms of also looking at global trade and inclusive processes, and promoting inclusive processes in global trade, the limitations of trade, traditional trade, mainly lies at the monopolization of transaction cooperations and high transaction cost. traditional commerce models have been more likely to be controlled by transnational corporations. From the global perspective, transnational corporations control up to 60% of international trade. By cutting transaction costs, cross-border e-commerce promotes increased inclusion of Southern actors in the global trading system, which help create more opportunities for small, medium enterprises, thus increasing the opportunities for countries in the Global South to deepen technological and investment cooperation. Cross-border e-commerce directly connects sellers and buyers, thus significantly cutting transaction and communication costs, and lowering the threshold for small and medium enterprises to integrate into the global value chain. In this way, cross-border trade, which was formerly dominated by large corporations, has begun to open up for small and medium enterprises and startup corporations. By integrating service providers from the entire industrial chain, cross-border e-commerce platforms optimize all major banks in cross-border trade. Southern countries can strengthen infrastructure construction, international cooperation by introducing foreign capital. The emergence of cross-border e-commerce platforms in the Global South not only provides comprehensive services such as product information, uploading, translation, marketing, customer service, customs clearance, exchange controls, and warehousing, but also specializes in cross-border logistics. Due to the convenience and inclusiveness, this lowers the threshold of small and medium enterprises in Southern countries to participate in cross-border trade more convenient. More cross-border e-commerce platforms provide an opportunity for small enterprises to open up online free of charge, thus enabling them to be fully engaged in the global supply chain without enduring lengthy, complicated procedures of traditional commerce models. By way of example, Mercador Libre, the largest C2C platform in Latin America, amassed a total of 52,000 vendors and 50.2 million registered users in 2017, ranking among the global top 50 terms of page views, with its business reaching 13 Southern countries, particularly in Latin America. Based on the unique features of Southern countries, cross-border e-commerce platform in these economies have forged some corporations models worth of further dissemination. In the process of promoting cross-border e-commerce, Southern countries have expanded technological cooperation through investment and acquisitions, in keeping with their respective development models. In the context of South-South cooperation, and since 2015, for example, Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba had continuously invested in Indian e-commerce and mobile platform Paytm. In the process, Alibaba has also brought in technologies and operational models that has helped develop, that was developed in India to the Indian market. This is quite unique and it's quite innovative, and it helps to promote a greater market share for Indian corporations wanting to expand overseas. I see that I've run out of time. Thank you.
About to finish, or?
Yes, I had one more.
So please do that.
All right. So in conclusion, however, many countries in the Global South still suffer digital infrastructure rudimentary problems, online consumption habits, underdeveloped logic facilities, and insufficient human capital for cross-border e-commerce, and thus fail to integrate in the Global South e-commerce network. Thus, the countries of the Global South should attempt to learn from the new technologies of developing countries that have been emerged and seek to engage in technical cooperation. Furthermore, Southern countries should strengthen and encourage innovation in operating e-commerce platforms that are suitable for local characteristics, thereby actively creating a better business environment to operate. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Well, thank you. May I now request Professor Irina Yarygina to make her observations. She is the head of the chair, Economics and Banking of the International Institute of Energy Policy and Diplomacy of MGIMO, under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, head of programs of the Financial University under the government of Russian Federation, member of dissertation councils. She is also the member of the Scientific Council of the National Committee on BRICS Research.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, first of all, let me pass greetings from the institutions that are the advisors to the government of the Russian Federation in the name of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Finance. And we are really interested in cooperation within the South-South and Triangular scheme because we have a lot in common. The thing is that we are looking forward to developing the economics of our countries, to the welfare of our nations, to their security, and within that there are a lot of challenges taking into consideration the United Nations agenda. Within these global goals for sustainable development, each country has its own interests. And within these interests, there are a lot of spheres of cooperation, such as healthcare, such as blue economy, green economy, cyber economy. And the only one thing that we should think over is just how to put it together and to find the mutual vehicles for cooperation. That is very important on the global geo-economic background, because actually globalization, I quite just think, and a lot of my colleagues share this opinion, that globalization actually is on a new stage of its development. It means that it is the stage of cooperation between alliances, between partners, between different groups. And we are the group of emerging markets, emerging economies that actually the power of it is growing. Somebody probably would not take it into consideration, and somebody probably can use some unfair rules in concurrency, but we are considering our relations as partnership, and within it we should go along the road of reaching harmonization between our rules. That is probably the most important thing to be done, because to work together, to cooperate, means just to use common rules, because we are the rule-based activity economics. And on this level, nobody denies that financial institutions play an important role. Our countries are the participants of a lot of different intergovernmental developing institutions. There are institutions within BRICS. As you perfectly know, that Russia is a member of the Eurasian Union, which has its own institutions. And most of the countries of South-South Alliance have agreements with Eurasian countries that gives great opportunities for partnership. And that is why we consider that within that, our countries and our cooperation should have its own priorities. The priorities should be given to the participants of economic and financial cooperation within the activity and the support of financial institutions. Probably it's worthwhile thinking about setting up a specialized fund for the development of small and medium enterprises under the New Development Bank, because it will be just a kind of a solving of employment problems, the problems that concerns the implementation of strategic interests and projects. Within that, it's just, it was mentioned, the New Silk Road, the North Route Road, probably the South Road. But it's not only the project itself. It's just the huge varieties and challenges for the infrastructure development in its, full thinking, because it's just the cyber possibilities, cooperation, such as the openness and exchange of information, business-to-business relations, government-to-business relations, and so on and so forth. Actually, we consider that is the period of probably public-private partnership, not private-public partnership, but public-private partnership, because the beginning and the developing of initiatives within the emerging markets depends on the support of governments. And within this intergovernmental cooperation, a lot of vehicles, a lot of instruments can be used to support our developments. I would like also mention that Russia is a member of the Global Society of International Financial Centers. We have an agreement since 1970s with BRICS stock exchanges, and that gives good possibilities for our partners, for everybody of us, just to cooperate on the financial level. As Kant once said, if something is done, it should be thought over and should be done in the interest of partners. That is why, that is the time that we should think over and take it into consideration, because there's a lot of new challenges. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Professor. We now have Mr. Manuel Montes, who is also the co-chair. So what I would request him is to make his observations, and then if he wishes to summarize the earlier panelists in as short as possible, because most of them were quite clear in their presentations and we are running against time. But nevertheless, it's your choice. So, Mr. Montes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Chair. I was actually going to talk about not being frank and calling a spade, because I was going to talk about the global system of allocating taxing rights, yeah? In a sense, as a response to the minister, as a response actually to the very useful comments that came from Mr. Pacini, that actually there's an important need to undertake structural change, right? Both nationally and internationally. What actually happens in the tax system is that the South Center is running a rather large international network of developing country officials, right? And right now the tax system is under attack. It has been found to be insufficient. It is actually the legacy of the colonial times when countries traded inside trading blocks. But then it has been overtaken by the fact that countries are now independent and they can take advantage of each other, right? So this system is through rules, standards, and practices, and it allows transactions that are allowed cross-border, across countries, right? In 2014, the IMF came up with a report in May 2014 that said that the international standards favored by the OECD countries, my talk is not against the OECD, but not against the development center, right? But it said that the standards, tax standards favored by the OECD countries are twice as disadvantageous to developing countries as they are to developed countries. So they're also disadvantageous to developed countries, but they're 2 times more disadvantageous. And actually, developing countries are twice as dependent on corporate taxation than to individual taxation, right? Because individual taxation is very difficult to collect in poorer countries. Now, in March 2019, this is May 2014, the first report. In March 2014, the IMF updated the report and said that many of the basic issues have actually not been addressed adequately by the BEPS project of OECD. It's the base erosion and profit shifting standards that the OECD is proposing. Especially with respect to the digital economy, this is becoming a very scandalous and very big problem. And actually, I'm brave to say it here in India because the Indian tax service is a leader among developing countries. So this is a form of tax cooperation where we operate in the UN, we operate in the OECD inclusive framework, so that the standards become more fair to the developing countries, right? So basically, we are very happy to be working with the Indian tax service because they have a proposal on digital economy that is very, very different from the standard transfer pricing rules that are favored for multinational companies by the OECD countries. So just to say at the end of my own input that we are building a network and we are looking to cooperate with developing countries about this, right? And then maybe I should quickly summarize. I think if I were to say that the Mr. Krisheti and Hani Biseda had a lot of parallel discussions about the possibilities of digital economy for small entrepreneurs and small businessmen. Mr. Biseda talked a little bit more about the international aspects of this, but both of them emphasized the importance of the fact that the credit due diligence for using digital technology is actually much smaller. And what actually I took from that discussion is actually this is happening without government support, right? In effect, it is an organic event. The question is, are there obstacles that are coming from government that are preventing the faster growth of these economies, right? But actually, it's a very promising system. But the other comment I have, if I may, right, is the fact that, because I'm old enough, 10 years ago, the solution to many problems, and this was mentioned by Mr. Bisada, the solution to many poverty problems was microfinance, right? And Mr. Bisada talked about how the transaction costs are too high, etc. Actually, the studies that economists have done about why it didn't work, and this was brought up by Mr. Pezzini, right? What are the structural obstacles to why it didn't work? My interpretation of the literature is it didn't work because unless the whole economy is growing, right? Unless the whole structure is growing and restructuring from agriculture to manufacturing, what you end up doing is creating a lot of debt on the part of households, which they cannot pay back, right? I mean, it makes the financial system much larger. The question is now, a lot of people can borrow, but it only works, and I think one of the few successful countries is Bangladesh, because Bangladesh was growing very fast, right? And in India, we know about the problems of farmers killing themselves, right, over borrowing money for fertilizers and all that stuff, right? And I mean, this is much lower in terms of due diligence costs and transactions processing. But the question is, unless there is growth that Mr. Pezzini referred to, then it would not be sustainable, right? Finally, Professor Yagarina talked about, basically, I read her proposals as basically emphasizing the regional aspect of structural adjustment and growth that actually was first brought up by Ms. Mario Pezzini, right? The first one is about the Russian Federation being part of a Eurasia group, right? And I don't know whether I can find my notes about, and also that the Russian Federation is part of a global financial centers group. So it is, the question still is unanswered, right? And this was brought up by the minister. Should we actually reform the multilateral system, or should we retreat into regional blocks, right? And Professor Yagarina talked about the fact that some of the international rules are unfair, right? And perhaps working within regional institutions or regional blocks allows some more scope for independence on the part of the countries that are involved. I tend to say that we have to do both, right? Because just like in the case of the tax system, I think there are, and I will suspect that actually Mr. Peccini would agree with me, right? That there are actually multilateral reforms that have to be carried out at a fundamental level. Actually talked about tables and different tables and all that stuff, right? That have to be faced, and this is the reason why the multilateral system is actually being withdrawn from. At the same time, it's important to work on strengthening regional work, because this is where countries are able to consult with each other at the very highest level, right? And allow each other some scope for growth. I mean, I don't remember, but I agree with one observation that I think it was Mr. Peccini who said, is that in Africa, the lot of manufacturing trade is actually within Africa, right? And this is, you say, it's also true within South Africa. It's the Latin Americans that are lagging behind, right? So with that, I think we should work on both. There should be a new commitment. Actually, it's one of the Yamoussoukro principles of South-South cooperation, right? And also one of the, I think it is principle 4 of the South Center where I come from, which is a intergovernmental organization of developing countries, that the South Center and the South countries are committed to building a multilateral system that is in their interest, that has rules that provide them with the space to actually grow instead of restricting their space for growth. Let me stop there, and I thought I also did something about what the minister was saying, right? It is time to be urgent and to do it now, right? Because otherwise the multilateral system will fall apart. Thank you very much.